am attorney Marie-Chris Bathan-Lasco. This is my virtual classroom. Welcome to my YouTube channel. In this channel, I shall aim to simplify the law. I will discuss concepts and principles of law in under 10 minutes. Hi everyone. So you already know what an obligation is. You already know what are the elements of an obligation. You also already know what are the sources of obligations. Now, let's talk about the different types or classification of your obligation, different classifications rather. There are different ways of classifying your obligations. One is as to sanction. It can be your civil obligation, it could be your natural obligation, or it could be your moral obligation. Second, as to subject matter, it could be real obligation or it could be personal obligation. When we say real obligation, it is an obligation to give something. If we say personal obligation, then it means it's an obligation to do or not to do. Okay? If you remember in the discussion of what an obligation is, it says there that an obligation is a juridical necessity to give, to do, or not to do. So, when you really break the last part of Article 1156, it will tell you that your obligation may be a real obligation or a personal obligation. So the obligation to give is actually your real obligation, and the obligation to do or not to do is your personal obligation. That is classifying your obligations into, or rather in accordance to subject matter. Another way is as to affirmativeness or negativeness of an obligation. It could be a positive obligation or an obligation to give or an obligation to do, or a negative obligation, which is an obligation not to do, which of course necessarily includes an obligation not to give. Now, as to persons obliged, we can also classify obligations with respect to that. It could be a unilateral obligation where only one of the parties is bound, and you have bilateral obligation when both parties are bound. Now, knowing the different kinds of obligations, it is also important for us to know the nature and effect of obligations. Now, the nature and the effect of obligations might differ also on the kind of obligations that we are talking about. So let's have Article 1163. It says there, every person obliged to give something is also obliged to take care of it with the proper diligence of a good father of a family, unless the law or the stipulation of the parties requires another standard of care. Now, this article basically tells you what type of care is required when your obligation is to give something. The law is clear. The law tells you that the standard of care that you must observe is that of a diligence of a good father of a family, or we call it your ordinary diligence. Looking again at Article 1163, it will tell you that it applies to obligations to give or to real obligations. An obligation to give a thing or to give something. Now, you have to remember that there are two kinds of things. It's your specific or determinate thing or your generic or indeterminate thing. What is a specific thing? A specific thing is a thing that is segregated from a class, while a generic thing is a class or a genus to which it pertains, and it cannot be pointed out with particularity. What do we mean by all of that? Let me give you an example. For example, A promises to give to B a Mitsubishi car on August 30, 2022. Now, is that Mitsubishi car? Is that a specific or a generic thing? It is a generic thing. You might say, why is that generic when there's already a brand there? Remember again that a specific thing is something that is segregated from a class. By the term itself, it is specific. It must be a particular thing. There are a lot of Mitsubishi cars out there. There are even a lot of models of Mitsubishi cars. So that cannot be considered as a specific thing. However, if the promise made by A to B was that he will give B a Mitsubishi car with chassis number 123456 with plate number XYZ123, clearly that car now is segregated from a class because you are now defining it with particularity. Another example. X promises to deliver a parcel of land that he owns in Cebu City. Is that generic or specific? Okay? That is still generic. Why? Because he may have had he may have rather a lot of parcels of land in Cebu City. And so it is not designated with particularity. Unless, of course, it is being stated this way, that X will deliver the only parcel of land he owns in Cebu City. Because then it is now being segregated from a class. There, it is now with particularity. That is the difference with your specific thing and your generic thing. Again, why is that important to remember? Why is it important to determine whether it's specific or generic? Because of our 1163, among others. 1163 applies only to the giving of something. And it applies only to specific or determinate things. That you have to take care of it with the proper diligence of a good father of a family. Now, can the parties agree to another standard of care, like extraordinary diligence or less than that of ordinary diligence? The answer is yes. They are allowed to do so because they may agree. However, they cannot agree to another standard of care if there is a law that requires a particular standard of care. Like, for example, common carrier, where your transportation law will require rather common carriers to exercise extraordinary diligence. So what is this diligence of a good father of a family? How do we determine that you have in fact observed the proper diligence of a good father of a family? Now, there is no uniform yardstick. Why is there no uniform yardstick? Because it depends on so many factors. And what are these factors? It depends on the circumstances of the person, of the time, and of the place. So, just like when you are driving a car. When you are driving a car, the diligence would be depending on whether you're driving in the morning or when you're driving at night. Of course, you have to be more careful at night. If you are driving on a winding road, or if you are driving just a long and straight road. So it all depends on the circumstances of the person, of the time, and of the place. And there is always a question to ask whether you have observed diligence. And what is that question? The question would be, that must be answered would be, would a prudent man in that same situation would have done the same thing that you have done? Because if the answer is yes, then you have observed that diligence of a good father of a family. But if the answer is no, another person in that same situation would not have done the same thing as you did, then you can be considered as not having observed the proper diligence of a good father of a family. So that's it for this video. We have talked about the different kinds and classifications of obligations, and then we also talked about what are the two types of things, the generic thing and the specific thing, and we even talked about the standard of care that we must observe in real obligations, which is actually your Article 1163. So for my next video, we will be talking about the next article, which is 1164. See you in the next video. So if you find this video helpful, please click like, subscribe, and that notification bell so that you will be notified of new video uploads. Thank you for watching. See you next time in MBL Classroom.